if this were yesterday, it would be Thursday. No, if this were yesterday, then today would be Thursday. And if this were morning, I'd say good morning, but it's actually Friday afternoon. So I think I can do one more mini lecture before the Sabbath in about an hour and a half. So let's start. Here's where we left off. So we're returning to the second of my lecturoids, or my lecturettes, or my mini lectures. And this is part deux of our discussion of the Republican Book 1 especially. And it's Roman numeral 2 on the notes I sent out. And what my aim of this discussion is to kind of get a sense of what happens during Socratic method, the Socratic dialectic. Remember that dialectic and dialogue are really the same word in ancient Greek and mean conversation, a two-person conversation. And as I said, as I pointed out in my prior mini lecturoid, that the beginning point of the Socratic method isn't some reimagining of human language. It's beginning with the way that people, everyday human beings, use words and language. Now there's a very complicated relationship between words, language, and thought. It's one of the great problems, issues, mysteries. In some ways, Plato has a certain take on it. Most scholars and thinkers, and I think myself, think that Aristotle, who has the same agenda of replacing opinion with knowledge, with science of justice, which again you'll see is what he's trying to do in the ethics for next week, that begins with our everyday words, the way you and I use words, because our life is an expression of our being. And Aristotle's probably right, although we can talk about this, whether or not other animals have speech as we have it. But in the Politics, his great work on what do you know, politics, Aristotle says, no, man, human beings are the rational animal, the animal with reason, the animal with speech, and the only animal with a polis, with a city, the sovereign political community. And by the way, not to turn this into a lecture on the politics, but Aristotle's aware that other animals have group life. He's aware of beehives and fraternities. No, I'm just kidding. But his argument is our political character, our coming together to use a deliberation with our other human beings over whom the polis, the city, has power, is the uniquely human activity. And political philosophy is I think for Plato and Socrates and perhaps Aristotle, it's the perfection of our lives in politics, where we have to live together, unless you're Tom Hanks in that movie Castaway, when you go out and have a long-term relationship with, I think it's a volleyball called Wilson. But if you're living with other human beings, whether it's a spouse or just a group, and by the way, as Socrates points out, even a group of robbers probably needs some kind of common deliberation, and the aim of a group of robbers may be to hurt and injure other human beings, but among themselves they have a common good, and therefore even robbers need some kind of justice. And so the Socratic method begins with the way we use words in every way language, because the words are the vehicles, the vessels of our opinions. And what the Socratic method does, and I'll try to show this at work a little bit in Book 1, does is it's the problem with our opinions, if you think about it, is most of us haven't thought about them. We haven't paid attention to them. We've accepted them, either because our parents or our city or our society or our church. We're all raised, and I wish I had time in this course to discuss one of the great images, metaphors of the Republic, which is the beginning of Book 7, the cave. According to Socrates, I'll just describe it, and you'll see what I mean in terms of getting back to how the Socratic method works. According to Socrates, all human beings are born in a cave. That doesn't mean the G dining hall. It means that all of us are born in a social and political world, and encased in our bodies. So, because we're animals who have consciousness on good days, we begin our consciousnesses of the world through our animal five senses. And as you're going to see, the ascent up to conceptual awareness behind the sensory experience is the emergence of human consciousness to finally culminate in conceptual clarity and through reason and dialectic. So the cave it's an interesting image. Socrates says to the boys, imagine you're down in a dark cave and there are people chained to the ground, and all they can see is the wall in front of them, and there's a little dim fire in front of them, and between the fire and the people who are chained to the walls, there are puppet masters who are holding puppets in front, and the fire from the shadows casts shadows on the wall, and the poor beings who are chained there, which is all they've known, think that that's reality, those shadows they see on the wall, which is the equivalent of our opinions, our social and political and personal opinions that we inherit or develop. And Socrates says, imagine one day one of the chains breaks loose, and one of these poor creatures starts crawling up to the opening of the cave, and then beholds the sun, and then all of a sudden is blinded from the painful clear light of the sun outside the cave. But once his eyes adjust, he actually sees what he thought was reality is now actually just a vague shadow. So Socrates says, what do you think if that guy went back into the cave and tried to persuade those people chained to the ground that what they thought was real and true was only an opinion? First they'd laugh at him and think he was mad, and then they would kill him. Again, the derisive laughter, satire of the fool who thinks differently from the rest of us quickly accelerates to murderous anger when you realize that he's challenging, the philosopher's challenging the essential reality of what you think is true in your opinions. And people often just don't like that, like Thrasymachus and others. So at any rate, let's go back to justice, and we'll see how this determines the unfolding of the dialogue. So Socrates starts from how we use the word just, and you'll see so does Aristotle. And I think it would be fair to say that if you think about it, we use the word just or right, or right, wrong, perhaps good and bad, although the question of the difference between goodness and justice is an interesting question. You could say that in some ways the conclusion of the Republic is that justice is a quality of the human soul embodied in actions and in the just regime, which is a part of larger goodness, that is both a platform for higher goodness, but also in some ways is a part of a larger vision of goodness. But for the time being, let's just say that every time you say, that guy's a really decent guy, a good guy, he's a just guy. I know just sounds a little kind of cranky and old-fashioned or quaint, but he's a good guy. In other words, you're saying something about that person's character and his habits, that on the whole, when you look at him, you see embodied in this person an image of rightness, a justice or goodness. Think about it. We also say that was a dastardly deed. That was the wrong thing to do. That is to say, the other major area besides a people's character and their dispositions, that we use the word just and unjust, right and wrong, fair and unfair, is in actions. And by the way, does that mean is it possible for a just person who overall possesses some quality of justice as a character trait, a soul trait, is capable of doing unjust actions? Both Plato and Aristotle say, yeah, that's possible. A just person can do an unjust action, but then you have to know what makes the just person just and what makes the unjust action unjust. The last way that we use the word just and unjust, or good and bad, right and wrong, is probably in our political life. Not just because we're Americans, but my guess is if I pushed you all and said, how many of you think that Nazism and National Socialism and both the governing ideas of Hitler and the kind of politics, and remember I suggested if you want to get Shrewsbury's nicest description of that, you might want to look at chapter 16 where he describes occupied Europe. But what he's really doing is giving you really an image of how the Nazis turned their ideas into practical rule, both within Germany but also among the conquered peoples, the inferior peoples of Europe and the rest of the world. And so starting with that, you shouldn't be surprised to see that as the Republic unfolds, it actually tries to answer the first character, the first two issues, a just person or character and just actions, by turning to the just city. Now, the reason Socrates gives that for book 2 is kind of playful. He says, well, because a city is bigger than a person, and it's easier. So let's take a flashlight, and so this actually leads to the rest of the Republic. Let's create the perfectly just city. Then we'll take our philosophic flashlight and see if we can find justice in it. And again, this is what happens at the end of book 4. It turns out that in order to know what justice is in the city, we actually have to know what the foundation of individual being is. And that concept, which I'll talk more about in book 4, is called the soul. And you'll see, whether or not you're persuaded by Plato or Socrates' effort to find an objective or a scientific basis or an empirical basis. Empirical is a fancy word that means capable of being experienced through human senses and thought. Whether or not you're persuaded that this enterprise works partially depends upon what you think of the concept of the soul, which is foundational in book 4, and I'll come back to that in my 4th lecture at. So what we're looking for, remember, he says we're looking for the definition, the idea of justice. What's an idea? Now, by the way, our word idea is just a Greek word, ideia. It's not even a translation, it's a transliteration. It's like the Greek word for art is techne, and you can hear the English words technology and technical, and so in some ways, both in terms of Latin and, like for instance, the English word art, which is the English Latin version of techne, art or science, is from the Latin word ars, which is what my department chair is. No, it's ars is the nominative form, and the other forms, the genitive and arse, artis, artem, etc. And so that survives in the English word art. But and again, think about it. You don't even think about the words technical or art. You know them, but those words are Greek, and so is the Greek word idea, ideia. What it means is ideia comes from the verb to see. And literally, to see the idea of something is to see, well, what is it that you see when you see the idea of something? Let me give a quick example. I have been a cat lover all my life, and pretty good at it, thank you. Excuse me. And yet, how many of you ever had a pet, a dog, a cat, a tarantula? God forbid why people want to make pets of tarantula. I don't know. That they wanted that, they could get married. Brump. Just kidding. I'm a sick man. I'm not responsible for what I say. Anyway, so let's say your cat got sick. Now, you might have had plenty experiences with cat, but to use a kind of a turn of a Socratic phrase in book 1, if your cat got sick, you'd take him to a cat doctor, because not only does a veterinarian, a cat doctor, know this particular cat like we sense it, the doctor knows the idea of catness, and therefore he can diagnose a sick cat and tell you what to do, because once you see the idea of something, a cat or a dog or justice, then in some ways you see what it is in its essence. And the word essence just comes from the Greek word essentia, which is both Latin and Greek actually, which comes from the word to be. So essence means the being of something, the true being of something. And one cat is different from another, but all cats are cats. So what Plato, Socrates are looking for is the idea of catness, to train the mind to see the idea behind the physical or the social convention. And in some ways, that's also what a definition is. So what I'm going to do right now is define a definition. And Aristotle makes more of this in some ways than Plato does, but I think both philosophers actually overlap. That when you provide the proper definition for something, you have used the unique human capacity of reason, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute, to see the whatness of a thing, and the idea of what makes that thing what it is. So to see an idea, to define something, is, according to both Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, the highest human power. Now, as I mentioned in class, we do all kinds of things. I won't go over all the kinds of things that human beings do in the course of the day with their bodies and everything like that. But here's my point. Right or wrong, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all argue that human beings have bodily functions just like animals. That's not what makes us unique. We have memory and sensation and judgment. That's not what makes us unique. But there's somehow right up on the pyramid of natural powers, there's this capacity, and I'll just define what reason is. The capacity to see sameness and difference is basically what Aristotle and Plato and Socrates define as reason. So what is it? Why does the capacity to see sameness and difference reveal the essence or being or idea of a thing? Because, first of all, when you see sameness, you locate the class of beings to which nature or reality has assigned that thing. If you've never seen a cat before, you don't know what catness is. But if you've had close personal relationships with as many cats as I have in my life, then there is a certain sense in which it's not just memory of all the individual cats. Your mind isolates the commonality between those beings and puts them in a... First, you see the difference between everything in that class by seeing the sameness of everything in that class. Your mind extracts the commonality, and then what your mind does is the next step is actually see the difference between the every member of that class. In some ways, those of you that have biology and have some scientific training know this is genus and species. So in a way, and if you go on to study political philosophy and study Aristotle's politics, and even the ethics for that matter, you'll see that what Aristotle clearly is trying to do is to find the class of things, the genus of things that makes it common with something else in its class, and then also to see yet how that sameness emerges in difference. Now, the other thing you have to see then is this is the key. This power is the key to our self-awareness. Because only a being that can see its commonality with everything that it sees around itself. After all, you and I are part of the universe. We're still trying to decide where Dr. Dunn fits in this, but let's just grant him the idea that he's part of the universe. That's my department chair for those of you who are unaware of conversitosity. But yet, what enables you to say the pronoun I and to see yourself distinct, having an existential uniqueness, which makes you different from every other part of the universe. Plato and Aristotle would say this is the direct result of our power of seeing sameness and difference, the reality of something in action. And it's the key to self-consciousness. It's also the key to political consciousness, because to see the sameness, which is to say the common good between you and other people in a political community, is the foundation for political justice. More about that in the next couple of days. All right, so that's what definition is, and that's what Socrates tries to do. Now, how does and again, just in the middle of page 2, I just summarized that when you've defined something properly, when you've seen the boundaries, conceptual boundaries between it and everything else, and then seen the differences between the members of the class, you've seen what it is. You've seen its essence. Remember, essence is just the word for being, and the true nature of a thing or concept. So again, now they may be right or wrong, but just you have to see that these three great thinkers think that we human beings are the only ones that have conceptual awareness. So how does this work in the dialogue? I'm not going to take you through every turn of argument, but you could say this is how the Socratic dialectic works, the Socratic method. Socrates asks you a question, and you answer with your opinion. And if you remember, Polemarchus's he borrows the somewhat flimsy notion of justice from his father and refines it a bit and kind of comes to helping friends and hurting enemies. And then what Socrates does through certain turns of the argument, he shows, well, wait a minute, if you say that, have you included this? In other words, Socrates finds examples that if you use your definition of justice, you can't give an account of the thing that you claim to be rendering intelligible. And sometimes, what often happens actually is the little missteps in your argument where you don't see the concept you're trying to see clearly. Socrates will kind of bring you to a point where all of a sudden he'll make you see that your opinion of justice or whatever you're talking about has led to a completely opposite reality than what you thought your definition implied. And oftentimes it's quite dramatic and real in a Platonic dialogue or a Socratic dialogue when that happens. In this case, by the way, it's on page. I'm going to use the marginal markings because the page numbers didn't fit on my copier. So right around 334b, the marginal note, I could explain what all those marginal, but that's the common way of referring to Platonic or Aristotelian works. So all of a sudden, at one point, Socrates says, "Well, this is what you're saying, that that just human beings make great robbers." And Polemarchus' reaction at 334c is, "No, by Zeus, but I no longer know what I did mean. However, it's still my opinion that justice is helping friends and harming enemies." So, as you're going to see, it's not that. Socrates simply played word games and walked people around in a circle so that, as you're going to see, that's exactly what Thrasymachus argues, and yet you have to see this as a kind of a refining and sharpening of human perception of the concepts by which we order our lives. So, in some ways, again, to say what's the Republic looking for? What's Socrates looking for? To use our language, that is to say, language that would come from our century and our culture. Socrates is looking to see the objective ground. Objective mean it just doesn't exist in our heads. It actually is embodied in the reality of the world around us. And by the way, this is the big question, I have to say, between ancients and moderns, between Plato and Aristotle. Are the ideas in your head simply pictures in your head that have no intrinsic connection to the world around you, or are the ideas in your head a refined seeing, which is a deeper and clearer seeing of the world around you? There's another way of putting that. Where do ideas exist? Now, we are moderns. We follow the kind of materialistic science launched by the philosophers of modernity, who in a way we're all neurobiologists who believe that the mental events in our heads are all just the subjective product of internal brain chemistry and personal experience and cultural shaping. So, in other words, there's no such seeing as an objective truth. Now, in its most radical statement, as I already suggested several times in class, that's what I would call existentialism. So this is a great question, but yet it would be fair to say that the Republic's intention is to launch the search for the objective ground of our value judgments. The Republic, and as you'll see, Aristotle is claiming to launch the science of justice, where literally you'll see the truth at what justice really is through philosophic and human reflection, as I've said a couple of times. So, what is the objective thing that Socrates claims philosophic examination of human being reveals to be the empirical platform of the objective notion of justice and good and bad? It's the soul. So in my fourth part of this lecture, I'll come back to that, and we'll talk about what exactly Socrates means by the soul. I'll just tell you this: it's not what Cephalus means by the soul, or what most Christians, Jews, Muslims, and everyone else means by the soul, or even what a Hindu means by the soul. The part of us that survives after death and goes on living for eternity because it's part of God's grace, God's eternal grace. More about that later. This is a big question. But as you're going to see, once Socrates reveals the nature of the human soul, and what is the soul, we'll talk about that, then he claims to have provided the foundation for a genuine and objective and scientific definition of justice. You've seen the idea of justice. Now, Thrasymachus clearly thinks this is bullshit. And if you go back to the point where and you can see him kind of fidgeting in the background as Socrates leads Polemarchus around the chains of dialectic. And so on 336D-C, that long paragraph, I don't know what page it is, but Well, anyway, it's in the marginal notes, 336b. Now, Thrasymachus had many times started out to take over the argument in the midst of our discussion, but he had been restrained by the men sitting near him, who wanted to hear the argument out. But when we paused and I said this, he could no longer keep quiet. Hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. This guy is pissed. Then both Polemarchus and I got in all a flutter from the fright of and he shouted out into our midst and said, "What is this nonsense that has possessed you for so long, Socrates? And why do you act like fools, making way for one another? If you truly want to know what the just is, don't only ask and gratify your love of honor by refuting whatever somebody else answers. You know that it's easier to ask than to answer," which is true, by the way, although to ask the right things may be just as difficult as giving the wrong answers. That's possible. But answer yourself and say that what you assert the just to be. And see to it you don't tell me that it's the needful, or the helpful, or the profitable, or the gainful, or the advantageous. Just clearly and precisely say what you mean, for I won't accept it. And Socrates, I was astounded. And there, by the way, in the next paragraph on the next page, I've actually struck off the marginal comments, but it's that paragraph where he says, listen, bursting out laughing very scornfully, and said, Hercules, here's that habitual irony of Socrates. I knew it, and I predicted to these fellows that you wouldn't be willing to answer. And somebody was pretty contemptuous outside, but to wrap this up and then to lay the basis for my third lecture, which is I'm going to try to summarize what I think is actually happening in Book 1 in terms of launching the search for justice, or the science for justice. You could say that remember, Thrasymachus is a trained sophist. He's learned the techniques of legal and public debate and argument. And what that means is he's learned how to give set, constructed speeches. And that's the art, the skill that he has. And that's what the sophists promised, that if you know how to argue skillfully, you can defeat anybody in a contest of argument. But it's like what you do is you set out your construction speech depending on your ability and your art to construct a persuasive speech, and then the other person, and then you duke it out. If you've ever been in debate club or ever been to law school, that's exactly what lawyers do. Now, it might be a calumny, an insult to lawyers to say that trial lawyers, anyway, strictly speaking, don't care about the guilt or innocence of the client. They want to win the case. And that's kind of pushing what sophistry is to its extreme end. But in a way, if somebody says, I just want to beat the other person, I don't care what's true, and I don't care what's right and just, my guess is your instincts about whether or not that's the right thing to do probably are coughed up a little bit. So Socrates then allows Thrasymachus to start. Now, of course, Socrates doesn't obey Thrasymachus' command, and he starts asking him questions. So by the way, as you'll see, Thrasymachus' ideas about justice go through several transmogrifications. But let's be clear what he starts out with, and then I'll kind of characterize what the nature of his thought is in the next lecturoid, the third part of this discussion. Thrasymachus is arguing that justice is the power of the ruling class in society. That what we call justice is just the power that the powerful exercise over the exploited, or the weaker, actually. So yes, Thrasymachus is in some ways a Machiavellian. There's no such thing as objective justice. Who wins is just who's more powerful. And all human society is just somebody using power to turn them into an instrument of their good. And if you read Machiavelli's Prince, his short, great work, Machiavelli is pretty blunt about this. All notions of justice and injustice, both in terms of human action and in terms of human character and political justice, are just phantoms. and the task of politics is to get power and hold on to it. There is no right. Might is right. Now, as you're going to see, Socrates twists and he gets him to admit that, well, no, but wait a minute, can't rulers make mistakes? So when a ruler screws up, I almost used an obscenity, which I've never done before in my entire life. Excuse me. So Socrates forces him to admit that sometimes rulers make mistakes, and so Thrasymachus modifies his opinion a bit and says, "Well, I mean, skillful rulers who possess the skill of ruling, especially the skill of crafting laws that cement their position and power in society. But once you admit that rulers can make mistakes, then you kind of push in the idea that ruling is a kind of a skill, an art, and even a kind of knowledge. That's where he trips up Thrasymachus, because just because you have power doesn't mean that you always exercise it to your own benefit. After all, you can screw up, and rulers can use their own power absolutely and order their subjects to do whatever they want, and you can end up losing your rule. So Thrasymachus ultimately, after a turn in the argument, is actually brought in some ways to where Polemarchus was. And that's why the second dramatic reaction of Thrasymachus is critical. He blushes. Because you all know when you blush and your face turns red, it's because you are embarrassed or ashamed. Thrasymachus' emotional reaction is a confession that he has been beaten by Socrates. Now, you, the reader, of course, have to decide whether or not Socrates did that by pointing us all towards the truth and not just screwing over Thrasymachus in word games. But as you're going to see, Thrasymachus' view of justice is an eternal one. It's a critical one. You could even say, in its most radical form, it's kind of Marxism, because Marx argues all politics is simply one class and set of society screwing over and exploiting another. The only difference is Marx starts out with that bitter Thrasymachus and Machiavellian insight, but then argues that if the revolution is done correctly at the end of history, then all classes will be eliminated and we'll all live happily ever after. So I will post, probably not this afternoon, but probably tomorrow evening, my third lecturoid explaining what I think Plato's larger intentions in the structure and argument of Book 1 are and how it launches the rest of the dialogue.